General topics, some introductory topics, but really it's more open to the things I read in the comments. I try to pay more attention to the comments than I can when I'm doing a more scripted video presentation. So it allows me to interact with you better, I think. Oh, hello, Dada. He's a good boy. So that's what I will try to do today. Now, I do have a general outline of things I want to talk about as it pertains to perspective and value, the things that you see in the thumbnail associated with the live stream. So I'll get to that in a moment. But let me just say at the start a few updates. So if you notice on the front page of the channel, probably the best place to go if you're looking for all of the videos is videos or playlists, because I've noticed on the front page it doesn't show every playlist, no matter how I try to adjust it. So, and the one playlist I notice it doesn't show is the CWJah Talk shows. We've done 30 of those, one of which has been taken down by A&E, the Ancient Aliens episode. I think that was CWJah Talk 12 on Ancient Aliens and the Flood. And so we're going to redo that show pretty soon, probably within the next month. And then I also have CWJah Talk 31 kind of in the works, and it will dovetail nicely with CWJah Talk 30, in which we talked about the scientific evidence for intelligent eternal life. And so now in CWJah Talk 31, I'm going to go into the historical evidence that Christian witnesses of Jah and others believe points to the biblical God as that eternal intelligent life. So I'm working on that. I've got other things going on. I try to, make shows or videos where I think it'll be helpful. And then I put other playlists together, as you can see, about, disproving flat earth. I don't want to hear biblical flat earth, and it's not biblical. But I do like biblical flat earth. He's a participant at times. He's a more good-natured flat earther that I don't find irritating. And so I don't mind him stating his beliefs at times. But there's a whole playlist for him and for all of you flat earthers or others who are dealing with flat earthers. I updated it the other day. New Wolfie videos. Wolfie's great. So you want to really pay attention to his channel if you're dealing with any flat earthers, and also the items on my playlist. And then I have the CWJah Talk Lounge, where, I try to put different music, and some of it, of course, you may like, and some of it you may not like. Just skip through until you find a song or a series of songs that you do like. And you may have to go through a few, because I, at times, will try to group together different songs that are similar and then change it up, depending on what I find and what I think will fit best next. But not everybody likes all musics, right? We have different frequency attractions. And so when we hear certain sounds, different people, we may like them more or less than others. It's just a fact. But I try to find music that is motivating on some level, right? Because we don't always have the same state of mind. Now, we're going to talk about perspective in a moment and how we should have basically an outlook, right? It's a perspective is your view. It's probably the closest thing to subjectivity, your own personal view, or even what they call my truth. Even though I think they misuse that quite a bit. The whole my truth thing that you hear Oprah and others say at times, that just means their reinterpretation of objective facts at least many of the times that I see them use it. But really, my truth is just another way of saying perspective. That's the right way to say my truth, right? My perspective, how I see things. And we're going to see in a moment, by going through a few biblical texts, that how we see things. I often will say, objective facts are important. That's what we base our views on, and they are. And at times that pushes subjectivity to a lower category, because it's more a view of the evidence, right? They can differ based on different people and what they want the objective evidence to mean. Some accept it for what it means. Sometimes it's difficult. Other times people just ignore it, right? And they give you their perspective. Well, there are times when perspective is actually more important than what is objective, meaning that the objective fact or item that we're going to review isn't really in question, right? It is what it is, right? In the cases we're going to review in one example, a coin is not disputed as a coin. But how you see that coin and the value, right, in another part of our discussion today, perspective and value, makes all the difference. And some of you may know kind of where I'm going. There's several texts, but we'll go through them in a moment. So, I have the CWJah Lounge for the purpose of providing a variety of different musics that I like, and just that I find it in listening motivating in different ways, right? They're not always the most peaceful, relaxing songs, but sometimes we need a little motivation, little different type of frequency in our day, or maybe not, right? That's really your perspective or mine. So I try to put together a list that gives you an insight into what I like, some of the songs. Not all of them at every time, just different songs at different times that I hear them I like. And so I hope you enjoy them, or at least they motivate you in some way. Right? I'm trying to at least invite you in to some extent so you can be a part of my day and what things I think about and listen to. And of course, there's a lot more, but we can't always be together with everyone. At most, we can be together closest with those who are nearest to us, if we're fortunate. And so even though I have this channel and different pages and things, most of which I've kept, on the down low and even private for a long time. Last year, around the time I did this channel, I opened up my Facebook page, made it more findable in the United States. I had to keep it hidden for a while. So I was dealing with so many things on a vocational level. I was being, in my view, and based on what I experienced, persecuted for my beliefs. So I had to kind of keep them a little bit more on the DL, the down low. But, I don't like doing that. Sometimes we have to manage our situations and do things and protect our interests in the long term. And that paid off because I was able to get through those more difficult times when I was around people who were holding those things against me. It's terrible. And so, I've gradually opened up that more. I kept Twitter. I wouldn't accept any invites for years because I just didn't have the time. I was going through so much. And but I always kept it going because it's a good way to communicate, maybe in an emergency or just when other things go down. So if you expect to hear a lot from me on Facebook or Twitter, that's probably not going to happen. I don't visit or use those mediums as often as I do YouTube. And so, because I can't do more than YouTube plus all the other things I'm doing and effectively accomplish it all. Now, maybe, again, your perspective, right? Your perspective may be different. You may think I'm just available all the time and everything is so easy. And of course, we all know that's not true. We all go through things and we all will go through things. But our perspective and what we value is going to make a big difference in terms of how we come out of what we have to go through as Christians and just as people in general. So before we get to those specific texts, I just wanted to give those updates. We'll have some more CWJah talk shows, 31 and the redo on Ancient Aliens. I will get back to the day text or text readings as they're known now. But see, to get to those things, I can't peel off and address too many separate questions. And that's why it's important for you to do your own research in ways that, well, I know I can probably help you if I've gone over it and you haven't, and you just want more information really quickly. I get it. But I may not have enough oil. And I hope you don't have to go out and buy it from those who do during a time that's not good. Nevertheless, you only, in my view, need three things. My perspective on the biblical text as a Christian witness of Jah is that three things are the most important above anything else. So while these other questions, right, even the ones I've done videos on, that of course I think they're important. I want to give people as much accurate information about all of the biblical information. But there's a difference, right? Isn't there a difference between things that have happened or that are happening versus what has yet to happen? There's a huge difference between spending your time speculating, or worse, as I'm going to show later, arguing about future things than there is when it comes to the value, the benefit of things that have happened. Because, for example, take the three things, right? Jehovah is God. We're getting to it. I've done the Eternal Intelligent Life series show, part of the series on identifying Jehovah as that eternal intelligent life based on historical, archaeological evidence that complements what we know about life being eternal, because life is here now. And so we can point to historical events that have already happened and even argue about those if necessary, because there's more evidence surrounding that we can deal with than anything that has yet to happen. Right? I mean, if we're going to compare evidence that would support scientific study about eternal life and archaeological, historical information as to who that life is versus when the resurrection is going to occur, or what happens when the dead are raised, or how many resurrections there are, well, which do you think you're going to have more success persuading someone about? I don't think it's even really a comparison, a legit, because we know that JahWah is more important. We know that the events associated with him, both scientifically and historically, are more credible in terms of pointing to his evidence than our view of different texts that apply to things that have not yet happened. Same with Jesus as the Messiah, right? Isn't that easier and more important to explain to someone based on the events that have happened and that we can point to historically? I've done shows on it, I've written articles, many people have, right? The biblical and non-biblical evidence that points to Jesus as the Messiah. And it's not like it's, in my view, it's very clear, but we get it. We get it that it's history. It's things you have to look at in terms of evidence and what's happened and what's happening now and make a decision. Well, it's still easier to do that with the JahWah and Jesus questions, right? JahWah is God, eternal, intelligent life. Jesus as the Messiah, foretold in texts that were written before he was born, hundreds of years, that in detail foretell this Messiah figure for a Jewish people who are being governed by the Romans, and whom that same figure then says is going to destroy them, for the reasons they're foretold in those very same texts that tell of his coming. And so there's a lot happening there that really, if you get into, I just don't see how you can get out. And if you get out of the JahWah and Jesus historical information and evidence and importance categories, well, then what are you left with, really, right? How are you treating people, right? We have to live our lives. We have to deal with all kinds of people, those who don't agree, those who do agree, those who claim to agree in many ways, but then who disagree, and who are often worse to us in terms of their treatment than those who don't even believe anything we believe about Jesus or Jah. We know that's true. I get most of the combative, debate, argumentative communications I get are not from non-believers. They're from people who claim to believe. It's terrible. And I get it. We disagree. They feel passionately about their beliefs and they think I'm in error. Right? They want to help me. Well, guess what? It should be pretty obvious that I can read, right? And that I've read these things and that I can see you can read. And I'm trying to help people who, while they can read too, they haven't read the same things that we've read or studied them to the same degree. So we don't agree. Great. Well, what does Jesus say? He says, if the law and the prophets are enough to convince these, it's not going to help if someone rises from the dead. You think you're more important than that? You think you're more impressive than someone who rises from the dead, who wouldn't convince a person who you think is not convinced by those same texts anyway? So why waste your time doing what the text and Jesus say you can't do? Right? Give people the text. If you can tell they've already read the law, the prophets, and the New Testament, and they don't agree with you, they don't agree with the Trinity, they agree that Jesus is the Son of God and that the sons of God are gods, but they're not rivals to their Father, who's the one God, the one who says they're gods, Psalm 82, and which Jesus used in his defense to what? Answer the Jews' question. We're not stoning you for a fine work, but because you make yourself a god. And those in the text and in which they confront him, making himself equal in their view to God as the Son of God. And what was his answer to them? Is it not written? Okay, that's our answer. That's it. The Jews accused him of the exact same thing the Trinitarians come to us and say from a different perspective. Right? The Jews are coming to Jesus claiming he's calling himself a god. That's the only way you can understand John 10 in that context, because his answer is to quote Psalm 82. Gods, plural. they were accusing him of making himself God, then quoting Psalm 82, gods, doesn't help him very much, does it? So his answer tells us what their question is. Why were they questioning him making himself a god? Because he was calling himself the Son of God. Who are gods? Sons of God. Simple. Done. Move on. Next. Right? I mean, instead, we get caught up into all this stuff at times, or sometimes it's necessary. I mean, Jesus was confronted. He didn't just run away every time they confront him. We get it. We've done it. We will. All the time, right? We're not answering machines for people. We're not debate machines, right? We're not here just to argue with other people because they think we need help, right? It's disrespectful is what it is, right? And it would be the same if we went to them and said, oh, we may disagree, but if we just kept going and answering, we're basically attacking them for not believing the same things we do after reading the same texts. Instead of going to people who haven't really read the text and saying, okay, let me share with you these texts, this evidence. You may not have really looked at it in the detail that I have that is, in my view, persuasive. So whether you find that to be true or not, check it out. Whatever it is, you can't do that with these apologetic nuts, right? Whether it's Watchtower nuts, Trinitarian nuts, just any quote-unquote Christian whose primary mission is to find other Christians, even if you disagree with them being a Christian. That's not what I'm talking about. My point is they already are claiming to be a Christian. So they're already answerable to the master. So what are you so worried about? It doesn't depend on you at all. Your job is to make sure they've read the texts, right? Law and the prophets, New Testament texts. If they tell you they've done that, or if by their engagement with you, you can see they've done that, unless you really need to take that opportunity to establish something so you don't have to deal with it all the time, like at work, wherever, there's always got to be at least that one time with someone, if they engage, all the time, and just allowing them to continuously take up your time and have you answer questions. Point things out to people, leave them information, but you don't have to keep doing it. You don't have to engage continuously, especially with other Christians, no matter who they are, right? Look for the ones who don't realize what's going on. All these other groups, Watchtower, Mormons, all of them, they have the text. I'm not worried about them at all. Not even a little bit, right? Because I had the text, I was in the Watchtower, and I was able to see it all. It takes a while. We grow through things. That's just the way it's going to be. So we don't need to worry, I think, as much as many people think. It's more important for us to have a perspective that allows us to see value in the more important things. That's really what it's all about, right? Because we could get sidetracked on anything and lose our value over everything. And we're going to see that illustrated in these biblical texts in a moment. Well, what benefit is that? So we should be conscious of whether or not our perspective is one that's giving us the right sense of value, right? In other words, is our perspective about how we're debating or engaging other Christians such that it has a high value? Why? They already have those things, as I mentioned. So wouldn't it be better prospectively? We'll answer this more clearly in a moment based on the text, but I'll say at this point anyway, wouldn't it be better to have a lower perspective of argument and debate with other Christians especially? I've never seen that really produce much of anything of lasting value. Sometimes it helps people resolve certain issues. They can resolve that on their own if they really want to. Yes, they can. Everyone can. Not everyone wants to. Not everyone wants to take the time. Not everyone is going to have enough oil to light their lamp. And they're going to try to take yours and mine. And as much as we might want them to have a lit lamp, they didn't buy it. They didn't go get and they didn't take the time necessary to find these things out so they don't have to keep asking these questions, right? If they haven't figured out by now that Yahweh, Jesus, and the Golden Rule are the most important things, not the resurrection that hasn't happened yet, or prophecy, chronology, all these things, future, right? If you're focused on those things, I don't see how you could be getting the most out of the most important three. There's no way, because the discussion is going to get off into a realm you can't resolve. Why? They haven't happened yet. Or if they have, it's a question of whether they have. And that's not the kind of question that's really worth engaging in. It doesn't have a high enough value, right? Do you want to argue over the fulfillment of the times in Daniel? Or do you want to argue about the fact that Yahweh, above all other gods, historically stands out? Do you want to argue about who's resurrected when and why? Or do you want to spend your time arguing about who's the Messiah and why? Why do we think that? To me, that seems so much more important and such a better use of our time. But it depends on your perspective, right? If you're an apologetic nut group, right, well, your whole organizational focus is going to be engaging other people, finding out who's teaching what you consider heresy. And, forget the fact that most of these groups belong to the cult of Athanasius, right? We'll get to him in a future video. There's a lot going on there. And I find it fascinating that a lot of these apologetic groups not only engage into such degrees of debate and argument, but, well, there's other issues that are going to come up. And so maybe I'm getting a little bit ahead. Okay, because there is a text in Timothy we're going to get to. So I'll save it for that. Right? I was about to get into some of the later discussion. So let's get to our texts, all right? All right, let's bring up Mark 12. We're talking about value and perspective. I think I saw Raul Reyes go in there, did I? Yes, I did. Good to see you, Raul. All right, value and perspective. Let's bring up the text. And we've been talking about valuing things like arguing and debate. And I brought those up because, they come up a lot, especially on this channel. I get things, messages, comments, things that really, to me, don't reflect even the people who don't agree with me's best use of their time, right? Why are they here? Why are they bothering me? Again, do they think I can't read? It doesn't make any sense, right? What they're really trying to do, in my view, is convince themselves. Because if they believe so strongly, like I think I do, I know me, they'd be doing this, right? They'd be trying to communicate on some level. I don't mean it has to be just like me. I mean, they'd be talking to people close to them or in ways like this, if it's not close to them, about Jesus, about God, about how we should be getting along as much as we can and not arguing and fracturing and making people totally confused when it comes to things that haven't happened yet or whether they've happened. Why would we spend our time on the least provable, the least historically definable? Because that's what a lot of people want to trap us in. And they do. It happens, right? These questions, what do we think of that? Hey, listen, why don't you read the text and follow what it says? That's the view. Does it make sense? Have a legitimate question? Maybe we can help. But I just don't think I'm doing a whole lot more than everybody else when it comes to understanding these texts. Right? Maybe I've read more, or maybe you've read more, but it's still just a question of reading the text. Now, a lot of these other things, they get, they get affected. Like, for example, I said the cult of Athanasius, right? So you have the people who follow the Athanasian Creed and the arguments of him and others who really distort the biblical text when it comes to the nature of God, right? They don't follow the sons of God theology. They can't figure it out. You can tell it to him over and over and over again, just like I did James White. He's not going to get it, right? He'd have to basically transform his whole operation. he'd have to go through a worse transformation, comparatively, than Hank Hanegraaff, right? The guy he's criticizing now and who used to run one of the larger apologetic nut groups here in Southern California. So, they're in this nonstop combative cycle. And even if you were able to get through to them and show them, hey, John 10, hello. Jesus responded to this very question. He said, Psalm 82, sons of God are gods. Therefore, it's okay that he's a God. John 1, 2. All these things, man, they're so easy. I find them so pleasing when I deal with them on my own or with people who are not having these same ongoing questions, right? Their perspectives in line with the text, their values adjusted correctly, right? They don't have these other things of value like the creeds, the councils, Athanasius, coming in and displacing the value of the text. Well, yeah, they'll tell you they just read the text and then you listen to them, right? Then you hear their answer. Compare their answer with Jesus' answer. Okay, our answer is no different than Jesus' answer to the Jews in John 10. If you have to explain more than that, I mean, sometimes maybe there's a few complicated, associated texts and you bring it all. I get it. I've done it. And, maybe I will if the right setting calls for it. I'm doing it now. But I'm doing it for a reason, right? It's perspective and value, and the Trinity often comes up, and it's an easy way to show how people can take the same subject, God, Jesus, and have a different perspective, right? A different value. You'll have Christians like me and others who don't believe in the Trinity, and we're not like, well, some do, and I call them Watchtower nuts, right? Or Unitarian nuts, right? They're just attacking the Trinitarians. I don't support that. I've made that clear over and over again. I don't agree with Trinitarianism, but I don't agree with attacking it and just spending all your time. We all go through it in each side, all sides. We grow up, we mature, but then our perspective has to mature. If our perspective doesn't mature and our value doesn't adjust, well, then we're not going to grow. And growing is a must. Let's go to Mark 12. All right, so we can look at some of the same things. God, Jesus, golden rule. Come away with totally different meanings. That doesn't mean they're different, right? But the perspective can be different. So Trinitarians, we would say as non-Trinitarians, although we understand, right, as Christian witnesses of Jah, while we're different people, and some may resist the Trinity more or less, we don't promote it that way. I advocate trying to accept Trinitarians as long as they don't argue with us about texts like John 10 and the true nature of God. But if a person wants to join CWJ and just be one who focuses on three things the way we do, not cause disruption, and they have a Trinitarian view that just allows them to make sense of the text, but really all they're doing is they're overvaluing the Son, right? And you may say they're demeaning the Father by valuing the Son as high as the Father. My point is they're not consciously and descriptively taking away from the Father, and they're elevating the Son and the Holy Spirit, but my point is it's mostly about the Son, at least in the textual discussions that we have. And so, how bad is that? I do believe it's a distortion. I do believe it's not in agreement with clear biblical texts. 1 Corinthians 8:6, John 10, Hebrews 1, all these things, right? But they have their text too. It's not like there's nothing there in ways that couldn't confuse someone and make them think that it's a legitimate way to view God and still be genuine in their desire to serve him. We can't make all these kinds of extended judgments, nor should we, unless they're openly teaching something false and confusing people. Otherwise, our perspective about allowing other people to worship Jehovah and Jesus in the right way as the appointed king, and the way we treat others, those have to be our critical goals because they're the most important things. There's nothing else that rises to the level of those three. And if our perspective isn't that way, if we see other things as equal to those three, well, then they're not going to have enough value, right? Then it'll be easy to get right off onto the resurrection, things that haven't happened, or that if they have happened are too confusing to make full sense of in ways to account for everything in terms of what the texts say. Although I think we can understand it pretty well. My point is, they haven't happened. not in the ways that these other things have happened or happen every day, the golden rule, so that we can use them more effectively in the ways that we're called to. We're not called to argue about the resurrection or dates and times and seasons. What does the text say? You don't need anything to be written to you about that. And that's how they communicate, right? If they didn't need anything to be written to them about it, they wouldn't be going around talking about it. So if we don't need anything to be written to us about those things, why? Because the day will come as a thief in the night, just like all the other texts say. Well, then spending our time focusing on those things is in direct defiance of the text. And that's what ends up happening, right? That's what these apologetic groups end up doing. They just don't realize it, or if they do, well, then it's even worse, right? We'll get to that in a moment. Further in a moment, I should say. All right, Mark 12. I'm going to try to get to comments more too. Well, let's get through some of these texts first. And, just mention something if you really need to. And if it's important to discuss apart from what I'm doing, we will. It's open session, right? I try to be more relaxed, but I also want to have something to present to you. My goal is to educate and build people up. That's it. To help you come to know Yahweh, Jesus. Yahweh is the one God. Jesus is the Messiah. There's a lot of other stuff, right? We talk about it. But the fundamental 3 points, the 3 things that if we spend our time most talking about, we're going to feel a lot better. We're not going to feel like we're unsure of those 3. They're clear. And the more confidence we have in those 3, the less value everything else will have. Because they're sufficient. And everything else will take place in its own time. Mark 12. Let's get to that text. Mark 12. We're going to read 41 through 44. And as most of you know, I am working on translating the text. I've spent several decades becoming familiar with it. Of course, you're free to accept or reject it, but I'm here to discuss it. And I try to be as available as I can to explain why I believe certain texts should be translated the way that I do. Or if I haven't translated it, then I'll use either the NWT because I'm familiar with it and I can discuss difficult issues most of the time, or certain other texts that I use as well. But the NWT is an easy one. Most of us are familiar with it, and it often lends itself to some of these different discussions. So Mark 12, perspective and value. So let's try to figure out what's going on here. We've talked a little bit about perspectives, in particular among Christians, and things like God, the Trinity, and how different Christians see those things and attach more or less value to them. And will devote their whole ministry at times to advocating against some of those things, and direct that ministry mostly towards professing Christians, whom they just believe are heretics, right, or cultic. But they have the text, right? So we should be reaching out more so, I think, to the people that don't have the text, because the ones that do, whether they're cultic or just ignoring it or whatever, they're going to have to answer for that to the master. Right? We don't need to keep beating them over the head with what's already taking place. Sometimes we can help, though, and I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the ongoing, persistent effort to direct your ministerial intention or activities, focus on other professing Christians. That does not seem to be a good use of a Christian's time. We try to help people, try to adjust them, but you can't all the time. And so if you don't understand that, you're going to end up spending an inordinate amount of time where you shouldn't be. Because your valuation of that engagement is off. Let's take a look at this text. It talks about valuation and perspective a little differently. But remember, perspective is as close to subjective as you can get in terms of things like an individual's view of things and that being correct, right? Sometimes we think of subjective as just an interpretation that's not correct, right? So subjective sometimes has the meaning of not evidence-based, right? The objective fact is reinterpreted subjectively by a person. That's sometimes how it's used. But there are other times when the objective fact, as I mentioned at the beginning, is not controversial. But your perspective of that undisputed item makes all the difference. Mark 12:41 through 44. Let's see how that is true. It says, and he, that's Jesus, sat down with the treasury chests in view and began observing how the crowd was dropping money into the treasury chests. And many rich people were dropping in many coins. Okay, so Jesus is watching from a distance. He sat down somewhere so he could observe the treasury. To him, right, the thing people are depositing items of value into toward the betterment of the exterior worship and support for all of those who help, do what is done at the temple. He's watching that process happen. People deposit money into this treasury for the purposes of beautifying and maintaining or doing whatever is done, and sometimes even obviously corrupt things. But nevertheless, he knows that's what that's for. Right? So that would be like you or me watching someone else, a whole bunch of people, depositing money into something that's going to go towards the building and betterment and maintenance of our Father's memorial, or, it depends on your culture, of course, but you understand where I'm going? You need to look at this with the right perspective. Jesus is watching people put money, coins, metal coins of value, into the treasury for the worship, the temple of God, his Father. There's rich people putting it in, and obviously others. And it says, verse 42, now a poor widow came and dropped in 2 small coins, size-wise, and it was small, which have very little value. Verse 43, so he, Jesus, called his disciples to him and said to them, truly I say to you, this poor widow dropped in more than all those dropping money into the treasury chests. Verse 44, for they all dropped in out of their surplus, but she, out of her want, dropped in all of what she had, her whole living. Now let me ask you, do you think the rich people right here who were dropping in many coins had the same perspective? What do you think the rich people here, and I'm not commenting when I say rich people, it's just what they're described as, right? I'm not saying these are like bad rich people. They're just rich, and they're in the temple dropping in a lot of coins. Obviously a lot of money, value, right? What do you think their perspective on the money they were putting in compared to the widow who put in the 2 little coins of little value was? Do you think their perspective was, she's putting in more than us? I doubt it, right? Because even if you're a good person, and by good I mean someone who doesn't look down on the poor, I think most people tend to think of the value of what they're giving to others, even to the service of God. I think it's natural to feel that association with the value you're parting with, even if you have a lot. Now, they had enough to keep going, so they weren't hurting themselves by giving in a lot, not according to this text. But it says that they gave in out of their surplus, so they had more. They weren't in need after that, even though they gave many coins. But she ended up wanting, because she put in everything she had, because it was so little. Basically, her whole existence is based on faith in Jehovah. And who else's existence is based on that same thing? Jesus's. Jesus' existence is based on the exact same type of faith, is it not? Right? He can get coins out of fish, and there can be ways of getting money that's not normal. But is he walking around with tons of money, right? Not really. Not at all. He's more like this widow who's constantly giving all he has, but then getting more and more. And of course, he's the son, the widow is not, but nevertheless, she's still going to continue to get what she needs. And she knows that so much so at this point, I would argue, that's why she's doing it. I wouldn't think this is the first time this woman has given all she's had. Probably she's done it before and it's just come back. So she's giving it again. Maybe it's the first time. Certainly be more difficult that first time. But once you give it and it comes back, you come back and you keep giving it, right? So the people who constantly take, constantly have to take. Whereas the people who give without being taken advantage of tend to receive. Either way, the perspective of this text is so critical, right? It's not like they're wrong in one way either. Isn't that right? Even though the rich people's perspective is probably different, right? They're giving in all this money, so they're looking at it as a lot more monetarily than the widow. Or other people, maybe they don't know it's the widow, but they know other people who don't put in as much as them, and so they comparatively understand their value, their giving. So there's not, their perspective is correct, right? I mean, the value assigned to the money among these people at the temple and in the society that existed is correct. They're giving a lot more money. Objectively, their perspective is correct. But prospectively, if you're looking at it according to the actual thing you're giving up in comparison to all that you have, right? Many coins in comparison to their surplus. Okay, they're going to have plenty after that. 2 small coins, and that's it. And she's got nothing after that. Now, what's your perspective? Now, even maybe the rich people, when you put it like that, would be like, okay, yeah, that in that perspective, right? That subjective view, which is true, the way Jesus and his Father see it, right? Not the way the rich people see it. They can be made to see this perspective, right? It's not the objective fact they all live with. But they can see what we're talking about if we make the comparison between what they give and what's left over and what this widow gives and what's left over for her. Now do you see why even the objective facts can remain the same? And your perspective make all the difference, right? And the value you assign, right? Perspective is so closely associated with how we value things, which is why I put those two together and wanted to talk about them in this show. Our way of valuing things is so closely, importantly related to our perspective, because your perspective can still be true and you can understand these things, but then you have to actually decide whether or not you believe them, right? You can see it, you can understand it in relation to Jesus, or you can go then revert and go back to just believing that more money is more money, or you can start to see things the way he sees them and change your value. That's really what this is about, right? If there's a baby, like a 6-month-old baby, child, very young, are you going to give it a diamond? I know it keeps looking like I'm making the 666. I'm not. I never do that. But that sometimes, I use that for like size comparison. I want to point that out because I don't want that being misinterpreted. Either way, are you going to give a baby what you know is a real diamond? No, I mean, not only would you have the potential problem of the baby choking on it, but the baby doesn't care that's a diamond, right? Whether it's a diamond or a piece of plastic that looks like a diamond, that thing is going into the mouth for analysis, and they don't care. Diamond, plastic, whatever, looks great, tastes great. Oh, I'll die if I eat it? Okay, the baby doesn't know that. But you know what I'm saying, right? They don't understand the difference in value between a piece of glass that looks like a diamond and a diamond. It might feel a little different, might taste a little different, but the value is not, they don't care. So if you are giving diamonds to people who don't recognize their value, well, don't be surprised if that's their reaction, right? If it's not as impressive as you thought it would be. And so it really better be a diamond, and they better understand its value if you're going to make the kind of connection that's based on having the right perspective, at least in this case, right? Because we're trying to make connections according to what's correct. We're trying to determine, at least in this case of Mark 12, who's doing the right thing. Well, what does Jesus often tell people that are trying to follow him? Sell all your things and be my follower, right? And even the rich ruler who had everything else lined up, he couldn't do that one. He had many things. And what does Jesus say? It's harder to get through the eye of a sewing needle than for a rich man to get in. But because of God, of course, all things are possible. Nevertheless, if we don't adjust our valuation of things, we can be easily misled. Let's go to another text. Mark 13. All right, so people can be misled in the sense that they see money as having true value, objective value, but they don't understand the right perspective on that money, and that is whether or not you're giving in proportion to the things you have, and of course for the right reasons. In the Christian sense, we give according to our ability, not under coercion, pressure, but we should be looking after people according to how we can, the people that need looking after. And that's really the perspective of this text, right? Are we only going to give in out of our surplus, or if people need it, will we give everything we have? What's our faith? We should be answering that ourselves, not for other people. That's what these texts are for. Let's take a look at another perspective. Mark 13, it follows right on this one. It says, and as he was going out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, Teacher, see what sort of stones and what sort of buildings. Very impressive. The account in Luke talks a little more descriptively about it. So they're looking at the temple, and they're directing Jesus' attention to the temple, right? An objective object, right? A temple, a large object. Right there, no one is questioning what it is, what its purpose is for. And they're amazed by it because of its grand construction and beauty. Verse 2, Jesus said to him, to one of the disciples that asked him this question as they were going out, do you behold these great buildings? By no means will a stone be left here upon a stone and not be thrown down. And it affected him so much. Verse 3, it says, and as he was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the temple in view, Peter and James and John and Andrew began to ask him privately, when will these things be? We talked about this in our last couple of videos as well, at least part of some of them. But the reason I'm bringing them up here is because what's the difference in perspective? Right? We had a difference in perspective in Mark 12 involving the money deposited into the treasury. Right? Jesus watching, sees these rich people, sees the widow with nothing. Each gives different according to what they have. And he sees it totally differently than most of the rich people would. Here, his own disciples are with him, and they're pointing out to him, things that you would expect, right? If they really are starting to believe in him and they see him as the teacher of the law and the prophet, the Messiah, this wouldn't be unexpected, right? They would be thinking in some way that this is a good thing, and that the fact that the temple is built this way is incredible, right? Look at this incredible building. Look at these things. And yet Jesus' perspective is what? I know what's coming. I know what's going to happen to that building. I know it's the temple of worship to my Father, but it's the temple rebuilt by Herod, and it's the temple that is run by those who are rejecting the one he sent forth. Right? Jerusalem, Jerusalem, how often I wanted to gather you together. He goes on to talk about it. But you people didn't want it. Right? We're not talking about all Jews at all times. We're talking about the Jews at this time. These people, not all of whom rejected Jesus. His own disciples were still following him, and many others did later. But there were many, particularly those running the temple of his father's worship, who didn't agree with him and who were promoting these views about the temple and about donating into the treasury that was the basis for what was happening. So they point out to Jesus these things, and he looks at it like what? Okay, you guys see the temple as it is now. I see the temple the way it's going to be. Not a stone left upon a stone will will remain. And so you can read the account of that in Josephus when the Romans came to destroy the temple in 70 AD. So perspective here is really key, right? What's the value, the way that the disciples are seeing the temple here is basically objectively true, right? So here, their perspective matches. They're not giving a different opinion that is at least questionable based on the evidence. It's more or less, and this is why perspective is not subjective, right? It's just very closely related to it, because your perspective can absolutely be true. Whereas typically, as I mentioned before, subjectively, in comparison to objective, tends to give the impression that the subjective view is not the same as the objective view. So perspective, though, tends to be, while closely related to subjectivity, nevertheless can just be objectively true, right? You're without much controversy in any direct sense. Now the perspectival difference we're getting to with regard to Jesus is about a future thing. He's looking ahead. He's in a unique position, obviously, right? No one else could really give this perspective in a way that would answer the disciples' question like that. But that's why I chose this text. And so it shows how you can have a perspective on something that is objectively true and yet still be entirely different from one someone else has, especially in this case when we're dealing with someone who knows the future. And as Christians, right, isn't that kind of important for us? Not in that we want to know the future in figuring it out ourselves, but we believe in God who knows the future. We believe in the Messiah whom he has appointed to bring about the things that will restore the earth and the heavens to the way he wants them. New heavens, new earth. So, in that sense, we can see things today that, like the temple back when this text, when these events were occurring, according to this text, we could look at things today and see, well, this is look at this. It's amazing. Look at all the stuff that's happening, what we're doing. Yeah. And that is all probably true. But do we have the right perspective of what's going to happen in the future? We all know what's coming at some point, whether it's the end of our life or the end of this system and the beginning of the next. At some point, things continue. Right? We're next. We're in line. We're in the process. It's happening. We're here. So our perspective is critical, right? I mean, we are in the game. We're in life. We're active. And so our perspective on what's going to change, things that we see now, but that we have reason to believe are going to change at some point, or that we look to change in the future at some point without getting too far into that, right? Like I talked about. That's a big thing, because if we don't have any future perspective, right? Like people who don't believe in God at all, it's just a question of humanity continuously evolving in whatever way it does. But we don't just limit our view to that, right? We look at the history, we look at the facts, we put it all together in terms of intelligence, design, eternal life, and where our perspective is, in our view, more complete, right? We see all these things occurring from the beginning until now, and we believe will happen eventually. So having the right perspective in terms of the temporary nature of this world, whether it outlasts us or not, is not really the issue. It's just, where are we putting our time and effort? We all have to work. We all have to have life. We do things. We have more probably than many of these early Christians. Some of us maybe less. So there are things taking place, but outside of all that or in association with it, how are we using our time? Are we helping the ones next to us? Are we constantly asking questions? Are we trying to debate other people nonstop because we think we're right? Maybe you are. But, they can find out. Most people can find out. Not everyone, though. I'm more concerned about the ones who are going to have a hard time finding out. At least showing them the information so that they can make a decision themselves. And that, to me, is key. And so my perspective, and the perspective I'm trying to share here, is one that allows us, hopefully, to focus on the three. Right? The value of the three will never wear out. Jah, Jesus, golden rule. Never. These other things are going to come, be fulfilled, and that's it. They're done. So It just seems to me like attaching our time endlessly or needlessly to debating over temporary things or extendedly about metaphysics when it comes to the nature of God and all these things. There's some value, but the value really doesn't go very high, not compared to the other things that are valuable in life and in the biblical text. Let's go to Matthew 16 next. I will get to some of your comments or questions if you're making them, but right now I want to go through these texts and then we'll kind of double back a little bit. We're going to go through Matthew, just a couple texts. This ties in part with the series we've been doing on the different time periods, the harvest. Again, those videos and the discussion of those things aren't meant to be a distraction. We do talk about them. There are texts. So I try to put them together like many of us do. But what I'm talking about is having a perspective that associates those things or with ongoing discussion of those things compared to the three things and whether the valuation should be the same, right? And if we don't think they're the same value, why we spend more or the same amount of time talking about them, arguing about them? We can present things, we can teach, but how much do we go back and forth over these future things or less certain things or less important things, less valuable things? Your perspective matters. I get it, right? Do you think the Watchtower Society and those who agree with it have a different perspective than you or I if you're a CWJ when it comes to times and seasons? Of course they do, right? That's a huge thing. That is high value, so much so if you're not on the same page, you're not good to go. So it's like a really big deal. We don't think they're that big of a deal. And we don't think they should be, or anybody should be making them that big of a deal. That's what I mean by discussing them to certain extents or putting them on par with more important things. Matthew 16. What did I get to, John? Matthew 16. And we're going to take a look at verses 26 and 27. Just two texts. These things change real quickly here. So Matthew 16. All right. This is really good. They're all good, but like I say, we go through different texts and some of them stand up more to me in different ways and or in relation to some of the things we've been talking about. So notice what it says here. Matthew 16:26. For what benefit will it be to a man? This is Jesus talking. If he gains, right? And by it's man or woman, right? This isn't really meant to exclude in terms of gender in these texts. Some are about men, some are about women. And there's not a bias there. There's more texts that refer to men as fools or stupid in Proverbs than women. But because men are more often the object, even when it's negative. So anyway, we'll talk about gender and biblical texts another time. For what benefit will it be to a man if he gains the whole world, but forfeits his soul? Or what will a man give in exchange for his soul? Get a little more natural light in here while we still have it. Verse 27, for the Son of Man is destined to come in the glory of his Father with his angels, and then he will recompense each one according to his behavior. Okay. Now that fits in with our discussion there about the harvest and prior videos, as I mentioned. But here, so often we get caught up in terms of the world, right? The system of things in which we live and through which we gain material possessions. Many people often will put everything they have into the accumulation of possessions, material things. And so Jesus says, if you gain the whole world, but you lose your soul, what would you give back, basically, right? What will a man give in exchange for a soul after you gain the whole world but lose it? What would you then, now that you have the whole world, give back for your soul? Well, what if Jehovah, just figured it right, in keeping with this text, what if Jehovah or Jesus said, I'll give you back your soul for the whole world that you have? Who of us would say no? Right? Because if you don't have your soul, you don't have anything, right? And so putting all your effort into possessing the world and giving up your soul in order to get it ends up costing you the world if you want your soul, which everybody does, right? Once your life is at issue, once your end is there, does it matter what you have in terms of possessions? You don't care. Here, what can I give you? Just let me live, right? I mean, that's not how we would be necessarily, especially if we were giving it in a Christian sense. We understand our life is temporary now, but not temporary in the future. So we give our life for Jehovah, and that's essentially the same as not having to die, because we just keep living by sleeping with him or being brought to life. Either way, we let him decide. Right? These are the kinds of future things we don't want to get too caught up into. But in terms of this illustration, right, this example, okay, so you get the whole world, you had to give up your soul. Now you die, you don't have the world. It makes no sense, right? It makes no sense. And that's why all these people who become rich and famous in these ways, they end up regretting the things they had to do to get it, because most of the time it involves giving up your soul or making agreements or contracts in life that are directly against the giver of life, and they know it. They end up realizing it because the hollowness of materiality becomes evident, right? When you put too much trust in it, when you give up your soul for it, you realize, no, I need the soul. I don't need the whole world. Oh, okay. So then don't put all your effort into the whole world. Put it into the soul. But your perspective, right? A person who doesn't really believe in the afterlife or a resurrection, are they going to care about this? Right? I mean, if you don't at least convince them on some credible level that there's a reason to look out for your future soul, your future life, that God exists, and that what you do matters, if you don't convince someone of that, well, they're not going to value their soul more than the world until they have to give it, right? And at the end, that's the easy part. But while they're gaining the world, if they don't believe in the after part, to them it doesn't matter. At least not at that time while they're giving up the soul to gain the world. Because they don't think there is an after. They don't think there is a resurrection. Some people, right? I'm talking about those who don't put all their trust in the material possessions of the world. And if you don't put your trust in all the material possessions of the world, or even in any of them, but you do believe in an afterlife or a resurrection, well, then you should show that by gaining your soul, it should be evident in some respects that you're not putting the world above your soul, right? We're in the world. It's not like you're not going to have any involvement, but there's a difference between people who pursue everything material in the best of ways superficially versus those who appreciate things, even finer things, but who recognize that our future life is the true value, not these material things. They'll be broken into, they'll be stolen, they'll decay, moth will consume, rust will, they're all going away. Unless Jehovah builds it, right? It's not going to stand. And even if he builds it and says it's going down because the people of the land goes down, right? He'll build it again. He's Jehovah, the Son. Help build everything with him. Put it all together according to the texts. And that's what they're going to do next. Restore the earth to a condition in which it will glorify God and bring honor to the creation. All right. And that's kind of talked about right here, right? Son of Man coming in the glory of his Father with his angels, giving each one according to his behavior. Perspective is key. All right, let's go to another text. Revelation 3:14. So we all know, of course, we're going to try not to get off on the Trinity stuff, but let's see. Let me check some of the comments real quick here. Okay, good. We're looking a little good. And it's all pretty clear, right? A lot of this isn't like, we have some shows where we get into things and they're a little advanced, but I try to break them down. You guys do a good job of commenting and questioning, but really what we're about here is to try to progress. We should come away from meeting with each other feeling refreshed, feeling like we learned something that's of value and that will help us deal with things in life as we're worshiping the same God together. Right? So that's how I see our time in these videos. And so when I get like repeated questions, some people ask me things, and that's fine. We'll get to questions and debates more in a moment. But it's more the repeated follow-up, right? I mean, I have things I have to do just like anybody else. But if you don't see that, if your perspective on me and what I do and my time availability is not accurate, well, you'll think I'm here all the time, just ready to answer all your questions, you know. That's not the case, of course. You know. So we try to deal with the most important things, and then we leave everything else up to you. And you don't burden me and I don't burden you. If it really needs to be answered, or if there's a real important thing, or sometimes if I write something that's in error or I reference the wrong page, I want to know those things. I'll tell you those things. But just tell me and then that's it, right? It's up to me to find out and then correct it if I made a mistake, or for you to do the same. Right? Then we got to get back. We got to get back to Jehovah, Jesus the Messiah, and the Golden Rule. That's it. How can I help you with that? That's what I want to know. My perspective and the things I value involve those three things. My perspective is, what can I do to increase people's view of the value of the three things? Revelation 3. Take a look at this here. We kind of talked a little bit about it also in our other videos, recent videos. Make a little drink here. It's a Star Wars cup. I have all these different cups, but to me, I don't care, right? I don't promote it based on my drink, or I just drink out of the cups that I have. And unless there's something really bad or something, you know, it's a cup. All right. Revelation 3:14. Let's read 14 through 19. Okay, and this is Jesus talking through the angels. You can go back to the earlier text, Revelation. I'm not going to get caught up in the different speakers necessarily. We'll just say this is Jesus talking at this point to make it simple. And to the angel of the congregation in Laodicea, write, these are the things that the Amen says, the faithful and true witness, the beginning of the creation by God. I know your deeds, that you are neither hot nor cold. I wish you were cold or else hot. Verse 16, so because you are lukewarm and neither hot nor cold, I'm going to vomit you out of my mouth. Now remember, we talked about how even though this is descriptively unpleasant, it's really the same thing as Jesus' illustration in Matthew and in Luke, Matthew 24:25 and Luke 12, of the servant with one talent, and how the servant with one talent takes the talent but doesn't do anything with it. Doesn't make any money, doesn't even deposit it in a bank so it can earn whatever interest would be earned during the time the master's away. And instead he thinks negatively of the master, but gives him back essentially the same value, the same talent. So the one with one talent that doesn't do anything with it, not even allowing others to make interest from the master, right, by supporting them, giving them the talent, they're neither hot nor cold. They're lukewarm. They're not doing anything, so he can't enjoy them. He can't drink them down. I don't think vomit is a good expression here, as I've talked about before. It's more just spit it out of your mouth, right? You drink something, it doesn't taste good, it doesn't taste right, you spit it out. You don't like it. That's the slave with one talent that thinks less of the master and doesn't do anything about the talent. Then, 17 through 19, because you say, I am rich and have acquired riches and do not need anything at all. Okay, so what's their perspective? He's talking about people who profess him as the Christ in Laodicea. And he's addressing them, telling them first, you're neither hot nor cold. You haven't done anything with the talent. But then he says, they say. So we're getting their perspective now. This is how the Christians in Laodicea viewed themselves and what they valued. Right here. They were saying, I am rich and have acquired riches and do not need anything at all. And then Jesus says, but you do not know you are miserable and pitiable and poor and blind and naked. And we'll explain what that means in a moment here. It's more descriptive, but it relates essentially back to the same illustration of the talents, or one of the illustrations that follows that, the illustration of the talents, that is of the man who bought a field and was so impressed by the amount of money he was making from it, he tore down his existing storehouses to build bigger ones to fill up so he wouldn't have to do anything for years. And so it's very similar, as you'll see. And then Jesus goes on in that illustration about the man in the storehouses in the field to say that's how it is with the one who is rich in a material way, but not rich toward God. Because when they come for the man's life, he thinks he's going to be sitting there enjoying, relaxing, not have to worry about anything, right? Because of his material possessions, the bigger storehouses, the field. But he doesn't realize they're coming for him that day. And so what does it all matter? You're not rich toward God. What does he say right here? They're saying, the Christians in Laodicea, that they're rich, right? They've got these storehouses. They've got this field. They don't have to worry about anything. And yet he's telling them they have to worry about everything. And so he says, I advise you to buy from me gold, right? Rich toward God. Refined by fire that you may become rich. And white outer garments that you may become dressed, and that the shame of your nakedness may not become manifested. And eye salve to rub in your eyes so that you may see. So this is more of an illustration descriptively explaining to them, you need to be rich toward me and my Father. Right? You think you're okay. You don't have anything. Your perspective is wrong. Right? Your perspective is you've got all the things you need and you don't have to worry about anything for a few years. You're good. No. They could come for you anytime. Your time could come anytime. The sun could come anytime. So it's not about us having that's nice. I'm not saying, Jesus isn't saying there's anything bad with having material things. The illustration of the man, the field, the storehouse, and these Laodiceans is that they're putting their confidence in their material possessions. And they're not doing the things that they need to do. What does he say right here, verse 19? All those for whom I affection, I reprove and discipline, be zealous and repent. So, they're all wrong. These are Christians in Revelation, the book of Revelation, being addressed, being told they're wrong. Their perspective is way off, right? He's going to spit them out of his mouth. They're not enjoyable. They're sitting around thinking they don't have to do anything when it comes to promoting his Father as the true God, promoting him as the biblical Messiah, and treating others the way they want to be treated. No, instead, they're putting their confidence in their riches, just like the man with the field who thought only about how much money he was going to make and being satisfied himself for as long as he could without thinking about anything else. If you have those things and you're thinking about everything else, great. You're good. Don't worry about it. But don't go putting all your faith and confidence in anything material. We need it. We know, especially now, right? We have shortages of certain things, and so it's evident that we have needs. But the fewer needs we have, the better. But the more value we attach to these material things, all of us, I'm not excluded from this. And I constantly am asking myself, okay, I like things, I want to have this and that, so I have to try to evaluate what's going to be best based on where I am, the family I have, the people I know, what I need to provide. And these are all questions for you and I. We don't go making them for other people. We shouldn't be, right? Not unless they're asking us for help or we need to give some encouragement or spiritual direction and support, but we're not here to be masters of other people, right? We're not here to make them feel worse about trying to do what they can to survive or make it more difficult to have similar beliefs to you and I. So how do we manage that? Well, we keep our required beliefs to a minimum. 3, Jah, Jesus, you and me. Everything else is for each person to decide. And it seems like a lot of people, they want you to tell them, right? They want to know. They want to hear it from someone else. Well, guess what? You don't need to know. And I don't even know, right? I just know what the texts say and what I think they, in association with each other, are telling us. That's it. That's exactly the same thing you can find out yourself when you read these texts and put them together. But I do realize people have connected them in different ways. And so sometimes, and with certain translations, things can be confusing. I just don't think it rises to such an extraordinary level that it should be dividing us the way it has. Boy, I mean, we have really allowed ourselves to become ineffective as Christians. And I'm talking about everyone. We have allowed ourselves to get caught up in debates and discussions over things that are either not as important or that we're valuing too much. Our perspective is off. We're looking at prophecies, times and seasons, resurrections, all these things, instead of just saying, okay, here's what the texts say. They seem to mean this, but they could mean that. Let's get back to the three. Instead, it's all about these other things. And the value rises to a level even higher than teaching the truth about Yahuwah or Jesus as the Messiah or the Golden Rule, right? The things that everyone really needs to know. And you can teach anybody the Golden Rule, right? You can show the consistency, non-hypocrisy in that. And you can start simply with things like that. And then work your way up to the history involving Jesus and Moses and all the writings that teach about Yahuwah, biblical and non-biblical. So there's a lot that we could be focusing on if we had the right perspective and valued things in their proper order. In any case, let's go to our last text. 1 Timothy. All right, I mentioned we'd get back to the debating and arguing and things, and you guys know I'll do that, and I have done it, and I will do it if I need to, but I just find it so destructive when it's not done according to a need. It seems like some, especially people who've been doing it a long time and who claim to be Christian, are just, that's their whole mission, right? It's to engage people in debate and argue. And while I see the value in it at times, it has a big downside. It really does, because it keeps us from doing what we're supposed to be doing. It keeps us from getting the job done. Instead, we fragment and dislike each other. More so than even people who don't believe in some of the same things we hold dear. We will fracture, fragment, and dislike each other because we have a different view of some of these texts. And it's amazing we've gotten to this point, because I just don't think we should have gotten to this point. But here we are. 1 Timothy 6. Let's take a look at verse 3. All right. Verse 3, this is Paul writing to Timothy, a young man. And Paul obviously was having trouble finding anyone whom he could rely on and get to take seriously the things that were happening, right? He even says, no one like him. And look at how much he wrote to him about. In any case, 1 Timothy 6, 3 through 8. If any man teaches other doctrine and does not assent to healthful words, those of our Lord Jesus Christ, nor to the teaching that accords with godly devotion. Verse 4, he is puffed up. If the bracketed words aren't essential, I'll just skip them, right? Puffed up, we know what that means, with pride, basically. Puffed up, not understanding anything, but being mentally diseased over questionings and debates about words. From these things spring envy, strife, abusive speeches, wicked suspicions, violent disputes about trifles on the part of men corrupted in mind and despoiled of the truth, thinking that godly devotion is a means of gain. What is he talking about there? Well, let's read a couple more texts. To be sure, it is a means of gain, of great gain. Godly devotion along with self-sufficiency. Verse 7, for we have brought nothing into the world, and neither can we carry anything out. Last text. So having sustenance and covering, we shall be content with these things. Okay. And then he goes on to say those who are determined to be rich fall into temptation and a snare and many senseless and hurtful desires, which plunge men or women into destruction and ruin. For the love of money is a root of all sorts of injurious things. And by reaching out for this love, some have been led astray from the faith. Led astray from the faith. And stabbed themselves all over with many pains. Okay, but notice he connects all of this, love of money, determined to be rich, and comparing that with sustenance and covering, having brought nothing into the world, not being able to take anything out, right? Being rich toward God, not rich in a material way. He connects it with this right here. The people who are teaching different doctrine that's other than doctrine and words that are other than those of Jesus Christ. So the text, right? What Jesus taught and is recorded he did and said. And the teaching that accords with godly devotion. You can interpret that, of course, in light of the scriptural texts that pointed to Jesus and all the things that show devotion to Yahweh. And, of course, anything that Jesus did and said that's in accordance with the godly devotion. But this really only specifically points to Jesus' words, the things he said and taught. If any man teaches other doctrine, okay, so we're not going to get into like the letters of the New Testament, things like that, because those are the things actually being written, right? They wouldn't be an object of attention as they're being written. And the reference is not to themselves, unless it's here. So it's other doctrine for sure than from what we got from Jesus, or that is to be derived from godly devotion. Things that would be in accordance with that way of worshiping Jah that was taught by Jesus himself. So if you teach anything else than that, you're puffed up, you don't understand anything, and what? You're mentally diseased over questionings and debates about words. I don't know if it could have been any more descriptively clear, right? I mean, if you were to ask, where does the Bible refer to apologetic nuts? Right here. Right? I mean, are they not apologetically debating and questioning? Well, what about this text? What about that text? What about this word? What about that? No. Right? On and on. Who's the firstborn? Same things over and over again. You could literally stop involvement with them right now. Spend 10 years helping the poor and the lowly and teaching those who don't want to argue with you. Go back to them after 10 years. Pick up right where you left off. No problem. If that's what you want to do. And so is it not true that when you get involved with the apologetic nuts, or when they like to get in, they like to burden us because they don't like our view of God and Jesus, they think we should all be Trinitarian, even though the Bible doesn't teach that explicitly. But still, all right, they come to you and they act nuts, right? Some of them do, not all of them. Some are very professional and nice. So I'm not talking about. There's some people in all groups that can act a little nuts, but there's a segment of apologetic nuts in Christianity that really attaches itself to debates and questions and arguments over words and all this stuff, and it just, I've never seen it produce very healthy results. I've been involved, right? And it has had benefits. I mean, a lot of people who watch my debate with White, Bowman, or listen to my debate with Maury, and I can tell it had a positive effect on it. I can read the comments or emails. And so, but if I were to continuously engage in that and constantly be arguing with them, I would end up what? I would end up thinking less of them, because our disagreement would rise to such a level that, well, what does it say here? It says, from these things spring envy, strife, abusive speech, right? Wicked. You start to dislike them because of the negative effect the constant debating and questioning has over something you care about. right? We care about God. We care about Jesus. We care about having the right text, right beliefs. So when someone wants to argue with us because they think we're wrong and they're looking at us like, we're bad people because of our view of these texts, well, then engaging with them is just going to bring forth more of that because we both have the text. We already know we don't agree. So what's the point? Right? They want to keep doing it. Why? What's the benefit? Right here. Oh, I'm not showing you all this stuff. Let me go back to the split screen. I was citing a few texts, so you couldn't quite see some of them in the last few moments, but nonetheless, I was reading it as well, and I was right here in the section we had just read. So it's this right here. It's what he goes on to talk about right here. They're doing it because they're misled, thinking that that's a way to gain materially in the world. They'd have to be thinking that, right? Because it's definitely not a way to gain spiritually. It says that right here. We've seen it multiple times. We see how Jesus is engaged by the scribes and Pharisees multiple times. Their perspective is he's a heretic. He's of no value. He's doing this. He's expelling demons by the power of demons, right? Well, what was Jesus' view of them? So perspective is critical in terms of how you're going to go about dealing with people and understanding how they're going to go about dealing with you. Most of these apologetic nuts, I refer to them that way because they come at us in a devaluing way, right? They're not trying to build up the Christ and point us all towards a more harmonious mission and effort to reach as many people with the message, simple and clear. It's never that. Never. They would never even do that, I think, because they don't see us as acceptable Christians. Whereas we allow for their aberrant views, right? Cult of Athanasius, all these non-biblical doctrines and things that many churches and traditions use to explain their views or make sense of certain texts when you don't need to, right? Sons of God theology takes care of that, along with the one God, Jah. All these texts are explicit and clear, but yet people need other systems of belief or doctrines to make them clear to them. So what do? Well, if they're not going to adjust to the biblical text, how much time are you going to spend with them? What's the value in that engagement? If they have the biblical text, right? There's plenty of biblical text today, unless they're in need of one. Even though they may have certain translation issues, don't you believe they can come away with the right understanding of the text? I do. I believe there's enough there that even though there are a lot of translation issues, and that's why I have a playlist on that subject now, they make it very difficult. And while many groups have condemned the Watchtower Society and the New World Translation for doing just that, I think it's in large part just the opposite. Right? Look at John 10. John 10 should not be translated, you make yourself God. Jesus' answer does not fit that question. So they end up making him look naive. It's disrespectful. It's blasphemous, actually. And it's a misrepresentation of that text. Even though theos can be translated God or a God, it's obvious in the context. They're claiming he made himself a God, which is clear also from his use of being the Son of God, which is the very basis upon which he justifies the claim to be a God. The accusation they made against him that he was making and that he did not deny, that he justified by using Psalm 82, gods, sons of God. All right, so all these things are not hard to define. But if you have a translation of John 10 with Jesus' answer stating, or the Jews' question being, because you make yourself God, it's going to kind of be more difficult for you to fit his answer with their accusation, and you're going to be a more prime target for a Trinitarian to say, see, they even thought he was claiming to be God. No, he wasn't. Did you see his answer? Yeah, they do. They see his answer. They just don't believe it. You know what they believe? You know what the Trinitarians who read John 10 believe? They believe he was claiming to be God. Even though they don't believe he is God. They believe he's the second person of God because there's only one God and that God's a Trinity. Now, does that sound like the biblical text or church tradition? You can just read one or both and find out. Meaning you could read the biblical text and see what is and isn't there and you'd find out. Or you could read the church history and tradition and find out as well. Certainly in terms of what it contains and at what time. But you're not going to find the biblical articulation of the Trinity and the metaphysics that it uses to explain God and his relationship to Jesus and the sons of God in the biblical text. You're going to find just what I referenced in John 10 and in these other texts. So then the question, as we started this open session discussion, where do we spend our time? What's our perspective on engaging different people, right? It's so easy to just continue to get caught up in these debates and discussions, but really, I'm trying to stay away from all that. I really am. Trying to steer us into a direction where we have clear, simple views that are easy to defend with explicit biblical texts and evidence that do not require interpretation beyond what is clearly stated, right? We can have a perspective on things, but certain things are only what they are, like the temple, right? Outside of the perspective that looked into the future in terms of what the temple would become in Mark 13, when Jesus' disciples asked him, said to him, look at all these things. And then he said, they'd all be thrown down. And they said, when will these things be? Right? No one is going to question that the temple they were referring to there was the actual temple, the objective fact under discussion. But your perspective on that temple is going to make a big difference in terms of how awestruck you are by it at that moment. Right? It's one thing to be the disciples and to look at the temple and to not even think of it possible of being destroyed, right? Totally. And it's another thing to be Jesus and know that's exactly what's going to happen. Well, it's one thing to have a biblical perspective that focuses on three things and allows everything else to happen according to Jah's will, versus have your whole perspective be geared around all these different biblical beliefs and giving them the same value, so that you could end up spending your time talking about things like prophecy, chronology, future resurrection, all these things, versus talking about Jesus, Yahuwah, and more clear things. And part of the problem is that it's just it can be more fun, right? When you're getting into these technical things, and it's just more interesting on some level. But that's the danger. Right? That's the perspectival shift we have to watch out for. Because what happens, right here? If we're not careful, we can become mentally diseased over questionings. What does this mean? What about this? Who's the firstborn? It's there, right there. Okay, answer, done. Don't ask the question again. But why is it called a mental disease? Because they keep asking the same question, right? Their perspective doesn't change, while yours is totally different now. Right? You don't see these debates and arguments and constant engagements with people who should already know and do know. They just don't believe the same thing, as of the same value as talking to other people who haven't had a chance to learn as much yet. And if we give an inordinate amount of time, and if our perspective is to see these types of engagements as the right way to live our Christian life, that's going to be a tough life. It's going to be a diseased life where, like I said, you'll be debating the same things for years, even decades, and you won't even realize you've made no progress. You still haven't answered the question, and you've probably lost that talent the master gave you. So you're not only going to end up being spit out of his mouth because you were lukewarm, didn't do anything. You just gave him back what he gave you. You lost it by going back and forth, debating over different views and arguing and becoming mentally diseased, right? These aren't my words. I mean, reading the text here. Is that how we want to be? I'll debate if I have to. I know most of you will too. We just don't always have to, right? I mean, the texts are pretty clear. And once you've reached this point where you know and you can see that it's clear and it doesn't bother you what other people believe. It doesn't bother you that they just keep coming back and saying the same thing. Your perspective is clear, right? It doesn't matter if the rich people think they're putting in more money than you, the poor widow. The right perspective is, I'm giving all I have. Right? It doesn't matter that buildings and temples and physical things are so magnificent. What's the right perspective to have? If it's not built by JahWah, it's temporary. Everything will pass and the new things will come. Right? If your perspective on material possessions is you've got to gain as much as you can, no matter the cost, well, if that's your perspective, then when your end comes, you're going to have a problem. Because you're going to have to give back everything you just spent your whole life attaining in order to get your life back. And that might not even be possible at that point. It's just the transaction you'd have to make at that, after giving your life for that. Whereas if your perspective was one that realized the importance of material things, kept them in balance, proper focus, so that you didn't have to give up your whole life and soul just for some extra money and possessions, well, doesn't that make all the difference when it comes to gaining your soul and giving up the world versus gaining the world and giving up your soul? It makes all the difference. What about the Laodiceans, Christians, addressed by the Spirit, according to Revelation, and told that even though they thought they were fine, they actually were not fine at all. They were so unfine, so not prepared or ready, he spit them out, according to the description he gave. They weren't hot or cold. It's not what he wanted. So whose perspective matters there? The Laodiceans or Jesus? The one whom the Laodiceans are supposed to be valuing, right? Not their material possessions. They're not supposed to be too worried or overly concerned about making sure they have enough for several years. Why? Because you might not have several years. But you will always have the Christ, and you will always have JahWah. You will always have you and I, if we're approved and able to live together now and in the coming age. So, let me take a look now at some of your questions. Sometimes I get going through these things and I don't give enough attention to your questions. I want to do more if they're based on the video. Sometimes I get questions or comments and they're not. And that's not really the objective, right? If you have a question or comment, it's just not related to the video. Maybe you think that's the only way you can contact me. That's fine. But I'll try to then answer you otherwise. But just understand, I don't have as much time to be around for every question or comment you make. I do the best I can. I try to give you these things, which I hope are encouraging. And that's about it. I mean, that's about all I can do. I think that's all anyone can do. And if you can do more, great. Let me take a look here. So, some of these questions. And I do have more videos coming. Just have a lot happening. Things are going well in some ways, but as you know, we're all dealing with the changing conditions and the environment that we have. So do your best to stay safe and use this opportunity to draw close to JahWah. I would tell you that for sure, right? I mean, right now, what's getting hit hard? All these terrible groups that promote these filthy, disgusting movies, right? Hollywood, Disney, all these groups and organizations that have really made a mockery of God. They really have promoted the opposite of the way he made us, male and female. They basically blurred the binary genders, tried to promote homo in place of hetero, abuse in place of love. Right? That's not love. You can do it. You can abort your child. That's not love. Just because something's legal doesn't make it love. Your perspective makes all the difference. And of course, what you value. But, these are the people who right now, if possible, I know we get bored. I like movies too. I watched one the other day with my son. Some of the older ones he hasn't watched, my youngest son. But I wouldn't give them a whole lot of money or any if you can help it, right? I mean, these people stand in our way. Most of them, right? They promote just the opposite of the things we're talking about. They don't want to hear about Jah. They don't even care about the evidence pointing to Jesus. And as far as treating others the way they want to be treated, I mean, unless it involves homo, they're not interested, right? Most of them anyway. That's how they want to be treated. But that's not how we want to be treated. And there's a reason for that. It's abuse. It damages people. Right? We're not just saying we don't want to do something that's good for us because we're discriminating. That's bad for you. It's like me, I don't smoke cigarettes. But it's legal to smoke cigarettes. But I don't do it, and other people don't do it because we don't think it's good for us in the ways that the ones who do it aren't really, they don't really care about, right? So I'm not going to try to stop them from smoking cigarettes. But that doesn't mean I have to start smoking cigarettes either. You do what you want to do, and I don't have to promote it, and I don't have to like it. Same with homo, right? I've seen nothing but destruction and negative consequences come from homo relationships. And while hetero relationships aren't always perfect, homo relationships are the worst. They're the most destructive by far, physically, spiritually, emotionally. They live on average 20 years less than a heterosexual practicing person. There are all kinds of unusual conditions they have to deal with because of the, anal abuse and other abusive simulations of normal heterosex, the way Jah made us, right? So all these companies and people who promote this stuff they're taking a hit right now. While I don't wish evil on or hurt, I don't want anyone to suffer. They're promoting things that are so disgusting and terrible. I certainly don't want them to come out of anything better off, more prepared, right? To inject more abuse into our society. We've had enough of that. So let me take a look here through some of the comments and just see if I make sure I didn't ignore anything critical in terms of our discussion. A lot of comments here, but I'll try to get to a few. Sometimes you're all just talking with yourselves, which is fine. And I want to try to keep it so the comments stay. With the new live stream control room, it hasn't been as easy for me to time it right, and so I've had to trim it a little. And I think sometimes that takes the comments away. But let's see. Let me take a look at some of the comments and stuff. So let me see if I can comment on, it looks like Michael Considine. He says, I think Jah has only allowed us to fully understand one truth, and that's the truth spoken of in John. Looks like 3:31-32. It's kind of small in the version I'm using here. The truth is easily understood and undebatable. I want to share it in one sentence. Would you like to hear it? Well, Michael, I certainly appreciate that. But I was kind of, as I was talking about before, we've read the Bible. We're not retarded here. We're not so ignorant that we are not accountable for the things that have been written. It's very kind of you to want to share things with us, and you're welcome to post whatever you want. I certainly don't agree with you that there's only one truth that we've been allowed to fully understand. So I'm not sure why you would state that, because there's very clearly at least three that are undisputable, right? Jah is God, Jesus is the Messiah, and treating others the way we want to be treated is the right way to live. So those are pretty clear and obvious to me in the biblical text. But we don't want to be preached to, right? I mean, either you have something you want to contribute. It's like I was talking about earlier, right? What's your perspective? Do you think you're coming here and helping me? Really? You think I'm like missing a text? You think there's something that if you show me from the Bible, a light bulb will go on? I'm sure if that's the case, you mean it well, but it's actually disrespect, right? I'm fully accountable for these texts. I've read them. I'm not someone you need to pander to or just enlighten me because you know what looks like John 3:31, John 3 or John 8. Yeah, I've read both of those chapters of John. And while I could certainly learn things from you and anybody, right? I mean, it's something that's why I read your questions and comments. But to ask me if I want you to read that to me as if I don't understand it and need to know it, that's disrespectful, right? And you may not mean it that way, but you're coming to a channel that, from all appearances and review, should have told you, I'm familiar with the book of John. I may not know everything, and I'm sure there are things I'll still learn from the book of John. But to come to me and ask me or anyone else who's obviously read the text, hey, can I share this text with you? I think you need to know about it. That's not the right way to approach other Christians. You want to know the right way to approach other Christians? Hello, fellow believer. Would you like to have some bread and wine? If it's available. Right then, without even saying anything, but by just participating in the one ritual we can all agree on, for the most part, we will know and be communicating the things that matter. The Messiah's sacrifice, the provision of Jah that makes it possible for you and I to be together. That's what you should be doing. If you're not prepared to do that with other believers, I think you have the wrong perspective. I think your valuation of things is off. And what you should be doing is maybe going to people who haven't yet heard of these texts and not acting like they're children. Most people are pretty smart. Some people act like retards. That's a fact. We all know that. But we don't want to be thought of that way, right? Do we want other people looking at us thinking, boy, you're treating me like a child, right? You're disrespecting me and you don't think I've even read that if a Christian, or maybe if they're not a Christian, maybe you could approach them instead of saying, hey, there's this verse in John I want to share with you. Maybe you should ask a person whom you're not even sure is a Christian, have you heard of this book written by John, a guy named John in the Bible? Yeah, I've heard of that. Have you ever read it? Because I find a lot of people haven't read it, but they've heard of it. And leave it at that, right? Wouldn't that stimulate most people who aren't active Christian thinkers to at least be curious about John, the book of John? If that's what you think is so important, Michael, these texts in John, why not try it a little bit different way? Why not try to get someone genuinely interested in what John had to say versus what you want? Right? Is it more important for you to get across what you want them to read? Or is it more important for you to get them to read John? I think it's more important for you to get them to read John. Now, I've already read John, Michael, so you're free to share anything you want. Post whatever you want. Just don't talk down to me. I'll try not to talk down to you. Now, if you're an apologetic nut, I'm not talking down to you. That's who you are. What did we just read in 1 Timothy 6, right? Mentally diseased. There's things going on that sometimes, we can't resolve. They're too far gone, like the scribes and Pharisees, and they just want to argue, debate all the stuff. So, and then there's different. So, like, for example, we get a question here, CWJah 2525. What are your thoughts on Sabellianism or modalism? None. Zero. Right, no 66 there. How about none? How about less than none if possible? I try to scratch out of my memory any thoughts I have, right? I don't care about those things or even the descriptions or categories. You do, right? You're asking the question. I don't care about those things at all. Those are labels people have given to things that aren't in the biblical text, that aren't really even very helpful, and again, tend to just confuse the issues, right? what you could ask me, CWJah, and it's your right? You can ask me anything you want. Your perspective doesn't have to be the same as mine. We just went through all that. But what I would do if I were you, and I'm not, but if I was, I would just ask, what are your thoughts about God? Right? And you'd probably get it all right there. And then if you wanted my thoughts on specific views of God, well, I mean, if you know my view of God, right? If you already know I believe the Father is the one God, and that the sons of God are gods that either follow or rival him, and those who follow him aren't separate gods, right? They can be called God, even called Yahweh, because they're acting for God, even speaking multiple times for God and Jesus in Revelation. Well, if you know that's my view of God, well, then you already know what I think of these other views, right? Just compare it, and it will show you. You don't need me to spend all this time talking about other views. You just need me to tell you mine. That's it. I don't owe you anything else. And then at that point, see, I move on from you. And either you want to keep promoting the same view of God as me, or you don't. Or you just want to keep asking questions about things and not compare it with the view I've already told you, right? I'm done. I don't need to keep, being your answering machine of all these different questions. That wouldn't even be productive in my view. I think it's not that I think it's you taking advantage of me, which it may or may not be. You may just be curious, right? I get it. But that's not a good use of my time. That's a terrible use of my time, right? To get off onto these lesser things. Again, what are we talking about, or trying to anyway? Perspective and value, right? Your perspective is there's value in these questions about modalism and Sabellianism and how it compares to the biblical God. Not me. I don't see any value in anything but promoting the three. Unless, maybe some other confusing issue comes up in a way that sometimes, right, if I'm dealing with someone who has your question might be more relevant. But in general, I think not. Yeah, I understand the identity of God's important. I'm not saying your question in like I said, in some respects, it could even be critical. I just don't think in general that's the way to go about it. I think it's better to promote the truth so that by comparison with all these other things, people can see what you view and what you don't view as far as their view. But to have to spend all this time getting into the details of these other views versus defending the details of your view, right? That's for them to do. Is the obligation for a Christian to properly defend modalism? No. It's for the person who believes in modalism to do. My job is to present my view, which is the one, Father is the one God, and the sons of God is gods, either for or against him. And so once I've done that, once I've established that view, my obligation is finished. Maybe I can answer more questions, but why would I do that, right? Why would I spend time, just like I've been saying, going in to these other discussions about these other beliefs I don't agree with, then spending time promoting the belief I do agree with? You see now what I'm saying? And maybe it just took me a while to get there. It's not that your question has no value or is not legitimate. It's just by comparison, the value is different. The perspective I have is getting off into those questions is so much less valuable when it comes to the use of my time. Sometimes even my responses seem a little harsh, right? I'm trying to keep it a little more balanced now, but sometimes I'll get questions, Facebook and elsewhere, and I'm like, look, you know what? Just tell me once, right? Don't keep telling me. Don't keep asking me. And sometimes people might be like, man, he's kind of a jerk, or, but I'm like, I understand that can happen. People might think less of me if I'm not as open to answering all these things all the time. That's just life. There's nothing else you can do, because it's either you try to say it nicely, but it never comes out right, or you just keep answering and you're just like there for people all the time. And I can't do that. I can only do what I can do, and I can only trust, at this point at least, that you see what I'm trying to do and you think it's genuine, or you don't, right? If I haven't given you enough video or writings by now to show you what I think and why I think it. I mean, there's always other things, of course, but do we need more? Right? If you already know basically what I believe and why, again, unless you're going to point something out you think I need to know, that's okay, but just do it one time. Or an occasional question, right? Sometimes things just can't find what you need. I get that. That's okay. But your question will kind of tell that. Oftentimes I get questions and they're answered in the very video I get the question about. And so maybe they just didn't hear that part of the video. Okay, fine. Well, maybe watch it again before you really ask that question. Or what? I've got to go through the video and find out where in the video I answered that. And maybe that's just something I'll have to do at times when people have questions after watching it once or twice. So, and I try to, but there are times when I'm like, look, there's nothing else I can tell you, right? I mean, this is what I believe. I've tried to explain why. I'm not hiding like some special knowledge, I'm not like sitting on a bunch of texts that are not yet revealed, right? And they help make sense of everything. No, I think it's all right there and is more sensible than we often take the time to show. And so trying to keep things clear and simple to me is the way to go. That doesn't mean we can't get technical. We do, and we keep it simple when we do, right? I think if you can't simplify what's technical, you don't really understand it, right? Because that's the whole idea. The whole point of being knowledgeable, and especially if you've gone to a university and you claim all this special training, right? And it's not that you can't get that on your own, but it's just that the ones that really make a big deal about all their learning, they should be able to make it simple the easiest, right? They should be the ones who have the clearest path to breaking down the complex and saying, see, do you see it now? Instead, it's often, they bring up all these grammatical categories and things, which, while some of us can understand and get through, the time it takes to get into all that stuff just so you can talk with some of these people, right? I mean, it's almost like a contest to see who knows what, which is the exact opposite of what we're supposed to be doing, right? What did it say in Timothy? Don't get involved into these debates or questionings. Sometimes we need to, right? Even Paul writes in Corinthians that we need to overturn the deep things of Satan. There are people we've got to confront at times. All the time, though? Everywhere? No, we definitely do not have to do that. And I don't even think we should be trying to do it. I think if we really want to make a difference for Jehovah and Jesus as the Christ and humanity in general, the three things will do, right? Everything else you can value, you can look at, you can have your own perspective on. I just don't see that you're going to get better than that. All right, let's take a final look through the questions. And hopefully I didn't miss anything of serious significance, but it looks like most of you made some good points and provided some comments that are useful and I hope benefit people. And Michael Considine, let's see what you did have a follow-up here. Hello, fellow believer. Thank you, sir. The wisdom of the book of Job. The truth is the meaning of these words, not the words themselves. We do not know the whole truth about anything. Okay, I appreciate that. And I hope it sounds like you took what I was saying the right way. I know sometimes things don't come out the right way. But remember, we're all kind of recovering apologetic nuts here. A lot of us have been through the rounds with different people in ways where we're sort of trying to refine our Christianity in a way that makes it easier to deal with different people, even different people with different beliefs. It's not easy. But I don't want to have to spend time finding out how difficult it is either. I already know. So I think our time would be better spent in those ways. But it's all about your perspective, right? You could debate anything, right? You could debate not just things like the Trinity. You could debate who's supporting the ministry, right? Are the rich people doing it? Or is the poor widow who gives all she has doing it? Well, maybe they're both doing it in different ways, according to each perspective, one of which is more appealing to others than the other is. And when it comes to the biblical text, well, we all know that we're fighting a war between our own sinful perspective and that of the world, and the perspective given by Jehovah through the Christ, through the law and the prophets, and through all these New Testament texts. So I thank you guys for joining me. I'm going to try to end the stream according to the right timing. It's a little bit different the way it is now, but I think I've got it right. So I hope you all have a great weekend. I'll see you again soon for our next text reading, and I'll see you next week for either another CWJah Talk show, open session, or maybe just a video based on something that's happening.